Welcome. You're joining us for a deep dive today. We're looking into something pretty significant, a major reorganization happening at the U.S. Department of State.
That's right.
And this isn't just moving desks around, is it? It seems tied to a bigger shift, this America First idea in foreign policy.
Absolutely. It's a broad effort. We're talking structure, priorities, the whole approach, potentially.
So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a bit. We've got excerpts from the Department of State Project 2025 document itself, news reports from places like The Guardian, Tampa Free Press, KYT, Government Executive, Stars and Stripes, Politico.
A good range there.
And also some analysis from the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs. Our mission, really, for you, the listener, is to boil this down. What's important? What does it mean? Without getting totally lost in the bureaucratic details.
Trying to cut through the noise.
Exactly. So let's start right there. What's actually driving this big shakeup?
Well, the immediate trigger seems to be Secretary of State Marco Rubio announcing this sweeping reorganization.
Right.
Both what he said publicly and what's in that Project 2025 document point to a feeling that state, as it is, isn't really set up for today's world.
Yeah, I saw reports, I think it was a Tampa Free Press, where Rubio was pretty blunt, called the department bloated, bureaucratic.
And unable to perform its essential diplomatic mission in this new era of great power competition. That was the quote.
He also mentioned, didn't he, that the size and budget have ballooned over the last, decade and a half?
Yeah, he did, without, in his view, a matching increase in effectiveness.
So, okay, for the listener hearing America First tied to this, what does that actually mean in terms of how they want state to operate?
At its core, it seems to prioritize, domestic needs and define national interests first.
Okay.
It often leans towards a more, perhaps, unilateral way of doing foreign policy, making sure states' actions directly benefit Americans and, crucially, line up with the president's agenda.
And this idea that the State Department needs fixing, that's not totally out of the blue, is it?
No, that's a really important point. Project 2025 actually brings up the Hart-Rudman Commission.
From way back when?
Over 20 years ago, yeah. That commission looked at national security after the Cold War, and they called state a crippled institution back then.
Similar language.
Very similar. Ineffective organizational structure, lacking sound management, accountability, and leadership.
Yeah.
And Project 2025, interestingly, says that critique still holds water today.
So they're saying it's a long-standing problem.
Exactly. A persistent worry about how the department actually functions.
But it seems like Project 2025 goes a bit deeper than just efficiency, right? They have a take on why these problems are still there.
They do. Project 2025 argues that a big part of the issue is what they call states' institutional belief that it is an independent institution.
Oh, okay.
That knows what is best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and does not need direction from an elected president.
So a fundamental clash over who's really in charge of foreign policy.
Kind of, yeah. How much control the White House should have versus the department itself. And the document also suggests, pretty clearly, that many people within state might not align with a conservative president's goals.
Right. So the goal isn't just making things run smoother. It's also very much about ensuring it follows a specific political direction.
Yeah.
An America First direction.
Precisely. Both Rubio and Project 2025 are very explicit about linking this reorganization to President Trump's America First policy. The whole point seems to be gearing the agency towards what they define as core American interests. Project 2025 puts it bluntly, state needs to be accountable for serving American citizens first.
Okay, so we understand the why. Now, for you, the listener, let's get into the what. What are the actual changes being rolled out? What are the key pieces?
Well, the first wave, the one getting reported now, is hitting domestic operations inside the U.S.
Right.
We're talking about cutting 132 domestic offices entirely.
Wow, 130.
And reducing D.C. staff by about 700 people. Government Executive reported that's about a 15% cut in the domestic workforce.
That's a pretty major cutback domestically.
Right.
It's more than just jobs, right? Structures are changing too.
Correct. They're consolidating functions that used to be specific to certain regions.
Right.
And eliminating offices they see as redundant. Plus, Secretary Rubio mentioned cutting non-statutory programs.
Meaning programs not explicitly required by law.
Exactly. Programs they feel don't align with core American national interests or promote radical causes. That was the phrasing reported by the government executive. And on top of that, potentially relocating another 137 offices within the department. presumably for efficiency.
And are we getting a sense of which specific parts of state are being targeted?
Yes, some names are surfacing. Politico, government executive. They've pointed to potential cuts or eliminations affecting the Office of Global Women's Issues,
Okay.
the Department's Diversity and Inclusion Office, and possibly several offices under the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights.
Like which ones?
Things like the Office of Global Criminal Justice, the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations.
So areas focused on human rights, global justice, stabilization.
Seems that way. And interestingly, the office that runs the Foreign Service Institute, that's the language training hub, its director position, is also slated for elimination.
Language training. That seems potentially significant for diplomats.
It does. It suggests maybe a shift in resources or how they prioritize those skills.
So quite a few cuts and changes. But it's not all cuts, is it? Weren't there some new roles mentioned?
That's true. There's the creation of a new assistant secretary post focused on emerging threats.
Oh, okay.
According to Politico, they'll report to the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. So maybe a pivot towards new kinds of security challenges.
It definitely seems like the initial focus is heavily on Foggy Bottom, on operations within the U.S. What about all the embassies and consulates abroad?
For now, the public announcements are targeting domestic offices. Sources like Heat are saying no immediate changes planned for overseas posts. But the undersecretaries have been tasked to come up with implementation plans by July 1st.
Ah, okay. So the door's open.
It leaves the door open for future changes overseas, yes. And the person leading this whole overhaul is the Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources designate, Michael Reedus.
So maybe a phased approach then. Let's circle back to America First in action. How do these changes, the ones announced so far, actually reflect that policy approach?
Well, Secretary Rubio explicitly tied it all to President Trump's agenda. He said, according to the Tampa Free Press and Stars and Stripes, that a reformed State Department will help make our country great once again.
Right, the direct link.
And Project 2025 gives more sort of concrete examples of how that America First idea might play out.
Like what? Can you give us some details?
Sure. Project 2025 talks about doing a retroactive review, looking back at all State Department negotiations and funding commitments made before a potential new administration, aligned with their views, would take over.
Reviewing past actions.
Yes. And also an immediate freeze on implementing any treaties or international agreements that haven't been ratified by the Senate, pending a review by political appointees. So basically hitting pause on a lot of existing international engagements to reassess them.
That sounds like it could really shift how the U.S. engages with international agreements.
It could be a major recalibration. The stated goal in Project 2025 is, well, to recalibrate how the State Department handles treaties and agreements, with a really strong focus on the constitutional process, meaning Senate ratification for treaties.
Got it.
The bigger picture seems to be stopping the State Department from acting, in their view, like an independent entity setting its own course, making sure it follows the president's directives closely.
Now, these kinds of big changes, they always raise flags, concerns. What are people saying? What are the potential downsides or criticisms?
Yeah, there are definitely concerns being voiced. Ronald Newman, writing in the Fletcher Forum, he talks about a potential loss of critical experience.
Correct.
Even calls it a possible hemorrhage of experience from these staff cuts and people being moved around.
A hemorrhage of experience. Strong words.
It is. He acknowledges, that big organizations sometimes need reform, but he argues this specific reorganization lacks, quote, visible logic for many actions.
Meaning it's not clear why certain cuts are being made.
Exactly. And he worries it could lead to a long-term weakening of America's diplomatic capability. So for the listener, it raises that question. What's the trade-off for these efficiency gains?
So the pace and maybe the justification for some of these changes are causing unease.
Precisely. People are asking about the thinking behind specific cuts, specific consolidations. There's a worry, maybe, that there isn't a clear plan for how state is supposed to do its job with fewer people and fewer offices. Right. The concern Newman raises is that you get these short-term efficiency wins, maybe, but you lose essential diplomatic work. You can't get timely guidance or action.
And the ripple effects go beyond just states' internal workings.
Yeah.
It could change America's whole posture in the world.
Indeed. Some analysts see this pointing towards a more, domestically focused foreign policy, maybe more unilateral.
Less cooperative.
Potentially. And there are questions about how that affects the ability to deal with really complex global problems, things like climate, pandemics, economic stability that kind of require working together.
Now, Project 2025 does lay out some specific foreign policy goals. China seems to be front and center.
Oh, very much so. Project 2025 puts a huge emphasis on confronting China, which it calls a serious and dangerous threat.
Okay.
The idea is to use the State Department as a key tool in that confrontation. They even draw parallels to the Cold War, talking about maybe developing an Article X for China.
Article X, like a containment strategy.
It implies something comprehensive, yeah. Using economics, security, diplomatic tools, everything to counter China's influence.
And what about international organizations, the UN, WHO, places like that? How does the America First approach view them?
That's another big area. Project 2025 argues against what it calls blind support for these organizations, meaning they want rigorous cost-benefit analyses. Is U.S. participation worth it? Does the organization align with U.S. interests?
And if not?
And if not, they suggest withdrawal is on the table. They point to past withdrawals, UN Human Rights Council, WHO, UNESCO, UNRWA under a previous administration.
Right.
While also noting, interestingly, that U.S. funding for international organizations actually increased under the subsequent Biden administration. So it highlights that contrast.
Is there a specific angle on human rights within that discussion about international groups?
Yes, there is. Project 2025 emphasizes what it calls authentic human rights and also national sovereignty in these forums.
Authentic human rights.
They reference things like the U.S. Commission on Unalienable Human Rights and the Geneva Consensus Declaration as sort of touchstones. The underlying goal seems to be pushing back against what they see as radical social policies being promoted internationally under the human rights banner.
Okay. Beyond China and international organizations, does Project 2025 suggest other big structural or policy changes for state?
It does. Several, actually. Developing a really detailed long-term reorganization plan. Maybe consolidating all foreign aid authority under one director of foreign assistance to streamline how aid is managed.
Centralizing aid control.
Right. And refocusing public diplomacy, things like broadcasting, to more directly serve U.S. strategic goals.
Got it.
The document also gets quite specific about regions and countries. China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea are priorities. But also the Western Hemisphere, Middle East, Africa, Europe, Asia, the Arctic.
So pretty much everywhere.
Pretty much, yeah, with specific policy ideas for each. The overall theme seems to be reevaluating relationships with friends and foes alike, based on a kind of hard-nosed assessment of who they really are and what they're doing.
It's certainly a massive proposed agenda, affecting almost everything state does. Looking ahead then, what are the big unknowns here? What are we still waiting to see?
Well, several key things. As we mentioned, while the focus now is domestic, will overseas posts get hit in later phases? That's unclear.
Right.
We also don't know the specific details of those workforce plans the undersecretaries are supposed to deliver by July 1st.
What the implementation actually looks like.
Exactly. And ultimately, the biggest unknown is the long-term impact. What does this do to the State Department's ability to conduct diplomacy around the world? Its influence? That remains to be seen.
It definitely feels like we're watching a potentially really transformative moment for U.S. foreign policy and for the department that carries it out.
I think that's fair to say. The next few months should tell us a lot more as these plans start to actually happen and we see the effects.
So for you, the listener, let's try to wrap this up. What we're seeing is a major overhaul at the State Department, driven by this America First perspective. It means cuts to domestic staff and offices, big structural changes aimed at efficiency, and a clear push to align foreign policy tightly with the president's agenda and define national interests.
That sums it up well.
And while the argument for it is efficiency and better alignment, there are real worries being voiced, too, about losing expertise, about potentially weakening America's diplomatic muscle globally.
It's definitely a complex situation with potentially big, lasting consequences for how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world.
And that leads us to a final thought, something for you to mull over. We live in a world where challenges, climate, health, the economy, are all deeply connected, aren't they?
Absolutely. Nothing happens in isolation anymore.
So what could be the long-term results, the potential consequences of the U.S. taking a more inwardly focused approach to its foreign policy in that kind of interconnected world? Something to think about. We encourage you to check out the sources if you want to dig deeper.
Definitely worth further thought.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive.